The 1970s reshaped the Western, but some films pushed the genre past the breaking point. Raw, unflinching, and drenched in blood, these violent tales didn't just shock audiences, they terrified censors. From gory vengeance to merciless massacres, these are the Westerns so brutal, entire nations banned them from their screens. This is their forbidden history. 1. The Hunting Party, 1971. At first glance, The Hunting Party might seem like just another gritty Western. A rancher, his kidnapped wife, and a gang of outlaws. But beneath the dust and saddle lies one of the most disturbing and violent narratives ever filmed in the genre's history. Directed by Don Medford and starring Oliver Reed, Candice Bergen, and Gene Hackman, the movie follows a wealthy cattle baron who embarks on a relentless pursuit to rescue his abducted wife from a ruthless outlaw. What sets The Hunting Party apart, and what ultimately got it banned in several European countries, was not just its violence, but its cruelty. The film's violent scenes, particularly a graphic assault sequence, were shocking even by the decade's standards. Combined with explicit gunfights where bullets tear into bodies with stomach-turning realism, the movie crossed the line for many censors. Hackman's character isn't portrayed as a noble hero, but as a sadistic man who wields his wealth and power like a weapon. His pursuit of the gang turns into a grotesque competition of who can inflict more suffering. This moral ambiguity, no real heroes, only varying shades of brutality, made audiences deeply uncomfortable. The violence is relentless, from close-range executions to lingering shots of dying men in the dust. Critics were split. Some called it a powerful deconstruction of the Western myth, while others dismissed it as exploitative trash. In Germany and parts of Scandinavia, the film was either banned outright or heavily censored, with entire scenes removed to pass classification. In many ways, The Hunting Party predicted the wave of revisionist Westerns that would come later, where morality was blurred and violence was no longer romanticized. But in 1971, the world wasn't ready for a Western that looked this deep into humanity's darkest impulses. 2. Cutthroats. 9. 1972. If there was ever a Western that blurred the line between horror and frontier drama, Cutthroats 9 is it. This Spanish-made spaghetti Western, directed by Joaquin Luis Romero Marchén, tells the story of a chain gang of violent criminals being escorted across snowy mountains by a lone sergeant and his daughter. When the prisoners discover that the chains binding them are made of gold, betrayal and slaughter follow. It was banned or severely cut in countries like the UK, Norway, and Australia for its unprecedented levels of gore. This wasn't stylized shootout violence. This was slow, agonizing brutality. Viewers witnessed prisoners being dismembered, burned alive, and shot at close range with the camera lingering on the carnage. One infamous scene shows a man's face melting after being set on fire. Unthinkable in mainstream Western cinema of the time. The film's bleak, snowbound landscapes added to the feeling of hopelessness. The cold, white backdrop only amplified the red of the blood, making every injury seem more vivid. Its combination of isolation, mistrust, and greed created a suffocating atmosphere that felt more like a nihilistic survival horror than a traditional cowboy tale. Marchant's direction pulled no punches. The violence was intended to shock, to make audiences recoil rather than cheer. That approach clashed with censors who feared that such explicit brutality was crossing into sadism. While an edited version did make it to theaters in some countries, the uncut print circulated underground among collectors, earning the film cult status. Today, Cutthroats 9 is remembered not just for its violence, but for daring to strip the Western of its romantic veneer and replace it with a grim, almost apocalyptic vision of human greed and cruelty. 3. A Town Called Hell, 1971. Sometimes known as A Town Called Bastard, this British-Spanish co-production pushed violence into operatic excess. Starring Robert Shaw, Telly Savalas, and Stella Stevens, the movie unfolds in a dusty, lawless Mexican town, where a mysterious widow offers a reward for the man who killed her husband. What follows is a cycle of betrayal, revenge, and relentless killing. From its opening massacre, where an entire church congregation is gunned down in cold blood, the film leaves no doubt about its appetite for violence. The deaths are staged with unsettling realism, often lingering on writhing bodies and the aftermath of the gunfire. The movie was criticized for reveling in cruelty, depicting torture and executions with a voyeuristic eye. Banned in Singapore and parts of the Middle East for extreme sadism, the film also faced cuts in the UK before release. What made it even more unsettling was its moral emptiness. The supposed heroes were barely distinguishable from the villains, and acts of brutality were met with silence, not condemnation. The movie's visual style, bold reds, dusty golds, and sharp shadows, heightened the sense of heat and tension, but it also made the gore more striking. Censors complained that it was violence for the sake of violence, and audiences were split between those who saw it as a grim anti-war allegory and those who dismissed it as exploitation cinema. Decades later, A Town Called Hell remains a fascinating case of how the Western, when stripped of heroism, becomes a mirror reflecting the ugliest truths about human nature. And in 1971, that was more than some nations were willing to allow. 4 of the Apocalypse, 1975, directed by Lucio Fulci, a filmmaker more famous for his later horror work. 4 of the Apocalypse stands as one of the most disturbing and unrelentingly bleak westerns of the 1970s. Based loosely on Bret Hart stories, it follows 4 misfit characters: a con man, a pregnant prostitute, a drunk, and a mentally ill man-child, as they try to survive in a savage frontier landscape. Fulci's West is no place of heroism or redemption. It is a wasteland where innocence is torn apart, and humanity is a rare commodity. The violence here is personal, intimate, and prolonged. Shootouts are not grand spectacles, but cruel executions. The most infamous scenes, including prolonged sequences of humiliation, assault, and torture, drew the attention of censors across Europe. Sweden, Norway, and Australia either banned the film outright or heavily censored its most graphic moments. The movie's villain, played chillingly by Thomas Millian, is a sadistic outlaw who stalks the group across the wilderness. His cruelty is not just physical, but psychological, breaking spirits before bodies. Fulci's camera refuses to look away from suffering, often lingering in ways that felt, to 1970s audiences, like an assault in itself. Even the moments of tenderness in 4 of the Apocalypse are tinged with tragedy. The bond between the 4 travelers feels doomed from the start, and the audience is left powerless as events spiral toward inevitable destruction. The juxtaposition of the film's strikingly beautiful landscapes with its relentless brutality made it feel like an unholy marriage between an art film and an exploitation feature. In hindsight, critics have praised the movie for stripping away Western romanticism, exposing the myth of frontier honor as a lie. But in its day, it was dismissed in some quarters as sadistic trash, and its bans only fueled its reputation. Among genre fans, it remains a raw and haunting entry in the spaghetti Western canon. 5. The Last Movie, 1971. Dennis Hopper's follow-up to Easy Rider was never going to be conventional, but The Last Movie was so chaotic, violent, and unsettling that it was pulled from release in multiple territories. Set in Peru, it follows a stuntman, played by Hopper himself, who stays behind after a Western shoot wraps, only to be drawn into a dangerous, surreal community where locals reenact scenes of violence with real weapons. Part meta-commentary, part fever dream, and part descent into madness, the movie blurs the line between staged violence and genuine brutality. Several scenes depict graphic beatings, shootings, and cruelty toward animals, enough to see it banned or censored in places like Singapore and heavily cut for television in others. Hopper uses violence not just as spectacle but as a critique of filmmaking itself. The movie within a movie framing makes the viewer question whether they are complicit in the brutality. Some sequences feel like documentary footage, with handheld cameras capturing chaos in the streets, often without warning. This unpredictability unsettled censors, who accused the film of glorifying lawlessness. Critics were divided. Some hailed it as a visionary deconstruction of the Western myth, while others called it self-indulgent, incoherent, and borderline dangerous. The fact that it came from Hopper, at the time one of Hollywood's most unpredictable stars, only added to its notoriety. In the years since, the last movie has been re-evaluated as a bold, if flawed, piece of cinema that challenged the way Westerns and violence could be portrayed. But in 1971, it was simply too volatile for many to allow in their theaters. 6. The Man Called Noon, 1973. Based on a novel by Louis L'Amour, The Man Called Noon might sound like a straightforward amnesia recovery Western, but its execution turned it into a surprisingly violent and morally murky film that landed it in censorship trouble in some countries. The story follows an injured gunfighter who wakes up with no memory of who he is, only to discover he's being hunted by killers. While many 1970s Westerns flirted with grit, The Man Called Noon embraced it fully. Gunfights here are brutal and intimate, with bullets tearing into flesh at point-blank range. Several torture sequences, including a prolonged scene involving branding, shocked audiences. In Spain and parts of South America, the violence led to delays in release, with some distributors demanding cuts. What makes the film notable is its refusal to give Noon a moral high ground. His quest for the truth is drenched in blood, and by the time he uncovers his past, the audience is left questioning whether justice has been served or simply another cycle of violence set in motion. Director Peter Collinson drenches the film in a somber tone, with muted colors and minimal music, making the violent moments stand out all the more. Unlike earlier Hollywood Westerns, where death was often quick and bloodless, here it is messy, slow, and emotionally draining. While not as infamous as some of the other banned Westerns of its era, The Man Called Noon became a quiet casualty of censorship, remembered today by aficionados as a hidden gem in the too brutal for its time category. 7. Keoma, 1976. By the mid-1970s, the spaghetti Western genre was losing steam, but Keoma, directed by Enzo G. Castellari, breathed new life into it with a raw, operatic intensity that shocked both audiences and censors. Franco Nero stars as Keoma, a half-Native American gunfighter returning to his plague-ravaged hometown, only to face brutal oppression, gang violence, and a warlord who controls the dying community with fear. While the plot nods to classic Western tropes, the lone hero standing up for the weak, the execution was far more uncompromising. The film's depiction of plague victims, emaciated and coughing blood, disturbed viewers. The violence, while stylized, was also unflinching. Point-blank executions, bloody beatings, and slow-motion deaths that lingered just long enough to be unsettling. One sequence where a pregnant woman is threatened amid the chaos, particularly drew censorship scrutiny. Adding to its notoriety was the surreal, almost mythic atmosphere. The cinematography bathed the West in a sickly golden light, while the haunting ballad-like soundtrack narrated the action in real time, a choice that polarized critics. For some, it elevated the film into an art piece. For others, it made the violence feel more mournful and therefore harder to stomach. In parts of South America, the movie faced bans for its combination of explicit gore and politically charged undertones, which some governments read as veiled critiques of authoritarian regimes. In certain European markets, heavily cut versions circulated, stripping out scenes of plague sufferers and prolonged gunshot wounds. Today, Keoma is widely celebrated as one of the last great spaghetti westerns, a fusion of Shakespearean tragedy and frontier brutality. But in 1976, it was too graphic, too allegorical, and far too bleak for some to handle. 8. Cry Onion, 1975. Tonino Valeri's Cry Onion is a strange case in banned cinema history. On the surface, it's a comedic spaghetti western parody, filled with slapstick antics and absurd characters. But buried within its humor was a level of cartoonish yet shockingly graphic violence that raised eyebrows in censorship boards, especially in countries that took their comedy more cautiously. The film follows Johnny, a goofy, onion-eating drifter whose bizarre odor and antics somehow land him in the middle of a land war. While the premise sounds harmless, the execution veers into over-the-top fight sequences that, despite being played for laughs, featured gallons of blood, exaggerated torture scenes, and a body count that rivaled serious westerns. Some censors argued that pairing humor with gory imagery made the violence more disturbing, particularly for younger audiences. One notorious scene involves a prolonged fistfight that escalates into characters being set on fire, riddled with bullets, and comically mangled, but with surprisingly realistic makeup effects. For markets like Norway and West Germany, the tonal clash was considered unacceptable, leading to outright bans or significant cuts. The movie's cult following grew in underground film circles, where fans appreciated its anarchic spirit and unapologetic chaos. But for mainstream release in the 1970s, its gleeful approach to carnage was a step too far. It serves as proof that sometimes censors react not just to the amount of violence, but to how it's presented. And Cry Onion's blending of comedy with grotesque imagery made it a rare, oddball casualty of Western censorship. 9. Blindman, 1971. Few Westerns were as conceptually bizarre and as shockingly violent as Blindman. Directed by Ferdinando Baldi and starring Tony Anthony alongside Ringo Starr, yes, of the Beatles, the movie tells the story of a blind gunslinger hired to escort 50 mail-order brides, only to have them kidnapped by a ruthless Mexican bandit. The premise might sound ripe for light-hearted adventure, but Blindman is anything but. The film is drenched in cruelty, with women treated as property, and frequent depictions of abuse and assault. Violence against men is equally brutal. Gunfights are close quarters and bloody, with the blind hero using sound and instinct to gun down enemies in scenes that feel both tense and unsettling. Its unflinching portrayal of mass slaughter, including a sequence where captives are executed en masse in the desert, earned it bans in several countries, including Singapore and parts of South America. Even in the U.S., the movie's theatrical run was limited, with some theaters refusing to show it outright. Baldi's direction amplifies the discomfort. The blind protagonist's vulnerability makes every fight feel unpredictable, while the film's dusty, sunburnt cinematography gives the violence a harsh realism. The tonal whiplash of having a beetle in a movie this dark only added to its infamy. In retrospect, Blindman is recognized by cult film fans as a unique and daring take on the Western hero archetype. But in the early 70s, its blend of exploitation-level violence and morally murky storytelling ensured it would be seen by only the most determined audiences. 10. Django Kill. If You Live, Shoot, 1971. Originally released in Italy in 1967, but only reaching certain countries in the early 1970s, Django Kill, If You Live, Shoot, remains one of the most bizarre, surreal, and grotesquely violent westerns ever made. Directed by Giulio Questi, this is not a traditional Django entry, but a fever dream of greed, betrayal, and sadism. The story follows an unnamed gunman, betrayed and left for dead by his own gang, who crawls out of his grave to exact revenge. What unfolds is a series of nightmarish encounters with townsfolk more depraved than the outlaws themselves. The violence here is both inventive and sickening. Bodies riddled with bullets are stripped of gold bullets embedded in their flues, with townspeople literally digging into corpses to retrieve them. Censors balked at scenes involving torture, hanging, burning, and a disturbing moment where a victim is tied and pulled apart by horses. In several countries, including the UK and Australia, the film's more graphic sequences were removed, and in others, like Singapore, it was banned outright. The surreal editing, cutting abruptly between violence and hallucinatory imagery, made the brutality feel even more unsettling. This was no shootout spectacle, it was a grotesque carnival. Questi layered the violence with surreal, almost dreamlike visuals, blurring the line between horror and Western. The absence of clear morality, everyone is corrupt, everyone is cruel, made it hard for audiences to find a moral anchor. Critics at the time were divided between calling it a masterpiece of anti-Western cinema and dismissing it as exploitation trash. In the decades since, Django Kill has gained cult status, praised for its uncompromising vision and bold rejection of traditional Western heroism. But in the 1970s, it was simply too savage for mainstream release in many places. 11. China 9, Liberty 37, 1978. A late entry into the decade's list of controversial westerns, China 9, Liberty 37, directed by Monte Hellman, combined slow-burn romance with sudden bursts of violence, and just enough eroticism to ensure it faced bans and heavy cuts in some regions. The plot follows a gunfighter spared from execution in exchange for killing a fellow outlaw, only to fall in love with his target's wife. What shocked censors wasn't just the tension, but the way the violence was filmed. Intimate, graphic, and unflinching. Gunshots left gaping wounds, and killings were often staged in unsettling close-up. A torture sequence involving the protagonist being beaten nearly to death was especially cited in censorship reports. The film's pacing lulled viewers into moments of quiet beauty, only to shatter them with sudden brutality. Hellman's direction gave the violence an emotional weight. Deaths weren't quick or clean, but drawn out, forcing audiences to sit with the horror. Its European release saw multiple versions, with Italy showing a more explicit cut, while other territories trimmed both the improper content and the violence. In certain conservative markets, it was refused classification altogether, making it essentially banned. Today, the movie is celebrated as an example of the revisionist Western, human, morally complex, and visually poetic. But in the 1970s, its combination of sensuality and savagery was too much for many. 12. The Great Silence, 1970s re-release bans. Sergio Corbucci's The Great Silence was made in 1968, but gained notoriety in the 1970s as it was re-released, only to face bans in multiple countries. This snowbound spaghetti western stars Jean-Louis Trintignant as a mute gunslinger and Klaus Kinski as a psychopathic bounty hunter, set in a blizzard-ravaged Utah during the Great Blizzard of 1899. From the start, it rejects the Western's typical romanticism. There are no sunlit vistas or noble showdowns. Instead, it offers a bitter world where the poor are hunted and the powerful kill with impunity. The violence is sudden and cruel, with no cinematic flourish to soften it. Victims die gasping in the snow, their blood staining the white drifts. What truly scandalized censors was the ending. Without spoiling too much, it delivers one of the bleakest conclusions in Western history: a mass slaughter of innocents and the triumph of evil. In markets like the UK, France, and certain South American countries, this was deemed demoralizing and too hopeless for audiences. Combined with its matter-of-fact portrayal of killings, including women and unarmed men, the film was either banned or heavily cut. Corbucci's snowbound cinematography turns the West into a frozen tomb, and Ennio Morricone's haunting score underlines the tragedy. While critics today hail The Great Silence as a masterpiece of moral subversion, in the 1970s it was simply too much, too violent, too pessimistic, and too unwilling to offer the audience a hero to root for. These banned westerns shattered the myths of the frontier, replacing dusty heroics with blood, cruelty, and moral decay. They were too violent, too real, and too honest for the world of their time. Which would you dare to watch today? Comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.